If you have your Bibles, kindly turn with me to Genesis chapter 29. Genesis chapter 29. We're looking at the life of Jacob. And we remember that Jacob is on the run because he's just duped his father, he's duped his brother. We come to a chapter where he's going to now be duped. And so, Genesis chapter 29, let me read the first 11 verses. So Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And he looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, there were three flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks. A large stone was on the well's mouth. Now all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. And Jacob said to them, My brethren, where are you from? And they said, We are from Haran. Then he said to them, Do you know Laban the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. So he said to them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. Then he said, Look, it is still high day. It is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them. But they said, We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and they have rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep. Now, while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So Jacob is on the run. He has been instructed by his parents to go to his mother's father's house and find a wife from there. He's also on the run because his brother, his elder brother, his twin brother, who was born probably just a few minutes earlier, is angry with him because he was duped by him in the previous chapter. If you remember, Jacob and his mother, Rebecca, come up with this ploy to deceive both the father Isaac and Esau. And so he's on the run basically. And we're told that he comes to the land of the people of the east, and he looks and he looked and he saw a well in the field. Now, well would have brought comfort for a traveler who's traveling on a long journey because it's a sign of civilization. It's a sign that people live there. Maybe somewhat akin to we're traveling on a lonely road and we see maybe a petrol bunk or some signs of civilization, some the dwelling places of certain people, and it would have brought him some sort of relief. And he sees this well, it's like a rest stop. And he also sees three flocks of sheep. And notice in verse 2 and verse 3 it says a large stone was on the well's mouth. That's important to note. In verse 3 it says all the flocks would be gathered there, and then the shepherds the shepherds plural would move the stone from the well of the mouth. I think that's just important to note at this point. But in verse 4 he says, when I was reading verse 2 and 3, just before I go to verse 4, I was reminded of a scene growing up when I was in first and I think first or second standard, when I was in Chennai in a school called Jesse Moses. And I remember during our break, we used to sometimes go and play in the field. And in the corner of the field next to our classrooms was this massive well, this huge well. And it had some semblance of a covering on it. It was basically a steel mesh. And some parts of that mesh were even damaged. So there was like a hole. And I remember sometimes climbing on the edge of this well and sometimes walking on the mesh towards the borders of the well. But I remember how dangerous that was, and I don't remember anybody falling, and I've never fallen. I don't know what I would have done if I fell in, because it was a very huge well and it looked very deep. So when I was reading this about the covering of the well, I was reminded of that childhood memory that I had. Thankfully, nothing happened. But over here, we're told that there's this large stone, which probably made a much better covering than the one that I just described, which was just this very badly maintained steel mesh. This was a large stone and was probably there in place to prevent people or animals, little animals, from falling in, prevent any untoward incidents. And so we're told it's a large stone. It was removed only when all the flocks were gathered there by shepherds, plural. But in verse 4, Jacob says he sees some people there. He sees the well. He sees some. He refers to them as my brethren. He says my brothers. He says, where are you from? Simply because he did not have a GPS system. Today we use Google Maps, and for the most part, Google Maps are fairly reliable. I mean, every now and then you will hear of some isolated incident, like recently I read about how some tourists from Andhra Pradesh, and they were in Kerala using Google Maps, and they drove into a river by mistake because they were following it so closely, and it led them into this river, and they had to be rescued from that river. So those kind of incidents are just isolated. For the most part, I've used Google Maps myself. Maybe you are using it as well. It is pretty reliable. But Jacob did not have Google Maps. He had to go and ask people for directions. He had to ask them, where are you from? Where am I? And so he asked these people, and they say, we are from Haran, which means mission accomplished, because he's there where he's supposed to be. This is where his parents told him, instructed him to go and find a wife from amongst his from from amongst his mother's family. He's specifically, if you look at verse 2 of the previous chapter, it says, marry the daughters of your mother's brother. So basically one of his cousins, and all that was permitted back in the day. I mean, many people ask, where did Cain get his wife? And the answer is pretty obvious. He probably married within, not probably, he did marry within his family, because that's the only way that they could reproduce at that time. But as you get further and further away from the fall, as you get further and further away from Adam and Eve, the genetic pool gets more and more corrupted, and none of that was possible. And today we know, when there is a marriage inside the family, very often it leads to disabilities in the child that is the child that is produced through that union. So and also, by the time you get to, initially God allowed it, but by the time you get to Leviticus 18 and 20, when God gives the law, there are a lot of relationships that are forbidden. But one of the relationships, interestingly to note, in Leviticus 18 and 20, one of the relationships that are not forbidden is a marriage between cousins. And here Jacob is going to meet his potentially his future wife. And most of us know the story, so it's not a spoiler. But so he asks, and he's come to the right place. He is in Haran, and he says to them, he inquires, and he says, do you know Laban? And they say they know him, and he's probably well known in that area. And then he asks, is he well? And they say he's well. And then they even say, oh, look, that's his daughter Rachel, who's coming here right now with the sheep. She happens to be a shepherdess, and she's coming. So in verse 7, Jacob says, uh, Jacob says, look, it is still high day. Is it not time for the cattle to be gathered together? Water the sheep and go feed them. He's giving the shepherd boy some instructions, basically, I think, so that he can have a few private moments to speak with Rachel. He sees Rachel, Laban's daughter, coming. He doesn't want them all to be eavesdropping. So he tries to delegate some responsibility and send them away, but they have a response to him. They say we can't do that. They have a method, something that they always, this was their method of operation. They said we cannot do that until all the flocks are gathered together, and they have rolled the stone away from the well's mouth. Then only we will water the sheep. So as they were still speaking, Rachel draws closer, and she's there with her father's sheep. And in verse 10, it says, and it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and sheep of Laban's, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled a stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. I just find that interesting, because I noticed in verse 2 and 3, it said it was a large stone, and it said that a number of shepherds included, so at least two or more shepherds would come and they would roll the stone away. But now maybe Jacob, to impress Rachel, gets this adrenaline, gets this strength out of nowhere, this Josh out of nowhere. He wants to make a good first impression. He wants to show her that he's a strong man. He rolls the stone away and he waters her sheep. And so That's why I said we need to make note of the fact that it's a large stone and it required many people to move it away. So in verse 11, we're told that, let me read verse 11 to 14. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. Then it came to pass when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into his house. So he told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month, for 1 month. So Jacob gives Rachel a traditional kiss of greeting, and then he lifts up his voice and wept. Maybe that confused Rachel a little bit. But then it's probably because he's being a little emotional because of the long journey, the tedious journey. Maybe he encountered many dangers on the way, but it's also because his mission is finally accomplished. Where after this long journey, it was many hundreds of kilometers, probably took him many months. He finally reaches his destination. It would have been comforting to for him to know after all those days and months on the road that he's finally reunited with somebody that he recognizes that is his mother's family, and it would have been tears of relief and tears of joy maybe, and so he cries after he gives her the traditional greeting. And in verse 12, he explains to Rachel that he was her father's relative and he was Rebecca's son. I have no doubt that Rachel, growing up, would have heard about her great auntie Rebecca, because ironically, her great auntie and probably Laban and his wife, whoever knew the story, would have told Rebecca and, of course, her sister Leah that they had an aunt called Rebecca, and at one point, Rebecca was looking after her flock or watering the camels at that point, and one messenger came from Abraham, possibly Eliezer, and came, approached her, and they went. And the end of that story, as we all remember, is that Rebecca ended up marrying Isaac. That was the great aunt Rebecca. So I'm sure that Rachel knew of that story, and now here she is at a well, and she's meeting Jacob, and she says, one of her relatives have come. She passes, she relays this information to Laban, and then Laban goes to confirm. He goes to check whether her story is true rather. And then in verse 13, we're told, yeah. And then it came to pass when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran and he met and brought him to his house. And then Jacob tells him everything. And then Laban says, "You are now bone of my bone." In other words, he's saying, "You're my flesh and blood. You are my relative." And so he stayed with him for a month. He extends to him great hospitality. But I just want to make note here, knowing the character of Laban, yes, maybe he was a very hospitable man, but I'm sure he was also pretty calculative. And we know that about Laban. Even in the past, when Eliezer came to meet, he was the one who took charge. If you remember, it wasn't his father so much uh, who was offering I always get Rebecca at that point. Yes, Rebecca, not Rachel. So he was the one who was talking to them about the deal, and he was saying she can come, let her stay here and all. He was the one who took charge because he was, generally speaking, a very shrewd man. He was calculative, and even here he would have probably had $2 signs in his eyes, because he'd have been thinking that Jacob would be a very wealthy man because of everything that he's going to inherit from his father Isaac, and so he would have been very happy to welcome him, and he extends to him that hospitality, and so he stays with him for a month. And then in verse 15, let me read verse 15 to verse 20. In verse 15, it says, "Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be?" Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter." And Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. So in verse 15, it seems like Laban is being good to him and saying, I mean, that's the way I read it. It seems like Laban is being good to him and saying that I should pay you. But I also read it in a way that he's saying you better get to work. You're not just going to sit around. 1 month has gone by. I know that's conjecture, but knowing Laban's character, it seems like he's saying you can't be here serving me for nothing. But in that is also that suggestion, or he's telling him you better start working around the house or in the fields. And so he says, what will your wages be? And so the insinuation basically is that Jacob needs to start working now. And so he says, what should your wages be? You can't work for nothing. And then the storyteller, the narrator, who's Moses in this case, tells us that Laban has two daughters. One daughter, the elder daughter, was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And the text in verse 17 says, Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now, last minute, I had to switch to an NKJV because I realized in my ESV, which I usually use, that this portion, for some reason, maybe over the years, it was torn. This part of the page was torn, and so I had to quickly last minute come to the NKJV. But in the ESV, it says her eyes were weak, and I think it's the same in the NIV. Here it says it was delicate. In the KJV, it says she was tender-eyed, and if you look at the NLT, it'll say there was no sparkle in her eye. The question is, what is the actual meaning of this? Is my conviction, or this is what I am convinced of. You know, I think that because there is a contrast here, the word, if you look at verse 17, the word but is there, which means both the sisters, in terms of their physical appearance, are being contrasted. They're being placed side by side and they're being contrasted. One, Leah's eyes were delicate. It could be translated tender eye, it could be, but what is the narrator trying to say here? I think here he's using an idiom when he says she was weak-eyed, or as the KJV says, tender-eyed, or whatever. I think he's using an idiom, just like how we sometimes say, "Hey, don't pull my leg," or something like that, or we say it's raining cats and dogs, or we say, "Oh, that thing cost me an arm and a leg." All these different idioms that we use. I don't think it literally means that she had to go to the eye doctor because she did not have proper vision. Now, there are different commentators who will say, some commentators say it does mean that she did have bad eyesight. Some commentators will say that it is just that her eyes were the most attractive part about her. But, apart from her sister, on the other hand, everything was beautiful about her, and those kind of different. I think I'm more convinced that this is basically an idiom where they're saying that she was it's an idiom which says that in comparison to her sister, she was not much to look at. Weak-eyed seems to be describing her entire, but whatever it is, both of them are being contrasted, and one is supposed to be more outwardly more attractive or beautiful than the other. That's what the narrator wants us to know over here. So moving on, now Jacob loved Rachel. So that's for the interpretation of verse 17, further confirmed by the fact that Jacob is after Rachel, not Leah. So it says, now Jacob loved Rachel. So he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And by the way, 7 years is a long time for to pay dowry or whatever. It's a very generous offer on the part of Jacob. So Laban said, it is better that I give her to you then I should give her to another man. Now, Laban is a guy who's smooth with his words and he knows what he's going to do. He says, stay with me. But, the real conditions of this deal are in the fine print. And, Laban doesn't mention it. He says, I'll give her to you, but he is not telling him he's going to give him to her after 7 years. So basically, in other words, Jacob has met his match. He's finally met his match. And Laban is going to, we know the story, Laban is going to deceive him. So in verse 20, it says, Jacob stayed, served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him. There's a saying, and I think there is some truth, and not completely true, but there's some truth in this saying. There's a saying or a principle which goes like this. It says, a person never knows what kind of servant they are unless people start treating them like one. So, in other words, many people will say, I have a servant heart, I love to serve and all that. But until and unless they're treated and they're actually in that position of serving, they themselves don't know what kind of servants they are and to what point they're willing to serve. But all that to say that Jacob was willing to serve Laban. And if you think about it, again, a little bit of speculation on my part over here. If you think about it, when you look at Jacob's days growing up, we're told that his brother was the manly guy, which probably means he was strong and he went out there as a hunter and he brought in game and all that. But it says that Jacob stayed at home, which means he was a home boy. He stayed with his mother. Doesn't mean that he was lazy or anything. That the text doesn't say, and that would be too much of a, going too far into the text or reading into the text. But we know that he is not really used to manual labor and just doing menial tasks and all that. But over here, he's willing to do whatever, whatever is required of him in order to procure Rachel as his wife. And so he says that I will work for 7 years. As I was reading this, I was reminded of a time again, the first time that I ever went abroad, or not went abroad, but went to the US the first time, 2009, where went to stay with this one guy, and I was the understanding was that I would stay with him. He would give me a room and give me food and all that. But I would do some work with him, and he was in charge of a camp for underprivileged children. And this campsite was in a very remote area up in the mountains, snow-capped mountains in the Rocky Mountains. It was the closest big city was about 1.5 hours away, called Denver. It was in the state of Colorado, and it was just me and him in this place. And for about 3 miles, which is almost 5.5 kilometers, we had no neighbors. So it was just me and him in this really really huge campsite. And so there were many times where I'd get up in the morning, and he would give me a task to do during that day. He would say, go and get this place ready, go and get that place ready. This was 2009, which means I think what, 16 years ago, about 15 years ago. And I remember I would get up, and sometimes I would do it, and sometimes I would get bored. But I remember when I got to one portion and I was just cleaning things up and tidying things up, away from the place that we were staying. It was such a huge camp. I remember discovering this, like it almost seemed to be some sort of secret room, because it was like a small little ladder, wasn't very easily visible, and then it had like an opening, and you open it, and then I discovered like this kind of like, if you will, a secret room. And it had many costumes over there. And I saw in the corner there was an old television set and a few cassettes over there with that old video player. You put in the cassette, VHS or whatever, and there was one movie, I think it was a Johnny Depp movie. And I put it in, and I remember, he thought I was just being mischievous. He thought that I was working, but I was sitting there and I started watching movie after movie, and then I would come in between for lunch and for dinner and all those things. So all that to say that Jacob, on the other hand, here he's really being sincere. He's really motivated. This is the person. Rachel is the girl he loves. He's willing to put in the hard work. 7 years is not a short period. He's not looking to cheat Laban in any way. He is a duper. He is a conniver, but now he wants to be sincere, and he's willing. He makes a very generous offer. And so in verse 21, after the 7 years, this is, so Jacob says to Laban, give me my wife. I mean, if you work for 7 years for somebody, I think you have the right at the end of that 7 years. Now the 7 years are complete. He says, give me my wife, but my days are fulfilled. He says, I've kept my end of the bargain, my end of the deal. My days are fulfilled, that I may go into. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. So it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought, and you start realizing something's wrong over here, that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? So obviously now Laban, happened, if Jacob was smarter, Laban is a tad bit smarter. Now the deceiver is being deceived. The one who used to dupe is being duped, and he's getting a taste of his own medicine, which reminds us of that biblical principle. Even I think in the book of Galatians, I'm not sure exactly of chapter number and verse, but it says, be not deceived, or don't be deceived. God is not mocked. What you sow, you will reap. And now it is come. This is the season where Jacob is reaping the harvest now. And he used to be somebody who duped, and now it almost seems like it's all coming back to him, or like that. To one of the songs says, "What goes around comes around." So he's the one now being duped. He's the one on the receiving end. He gets a taste of his own medicine, and it says that he ended up, or he found out that he was cheated, and he ended up with the wrong sister. And it's ironic because even his subterfuge, his deception, had to do something with switching siblings. If you remember in the previous chapter, he pretended to be his elder brother Esau, and now Leah pretends to be the young. Only difference is older. Young, there it was older, here it is younger. That's the only difference. But it's the irony is unreal. So he finds out that is Leah. Now, of course, sometimes that question occurs in our head: how did he not know it was Leah when she came to the bridal tent, or whatever it is? And the answer is, I think, back in the day, sometimes they didn't have this kind of lighting that we have here today. Even this lighting is not great, but they did not have all these, they didn't have electricity. They probably use candles, and they probably use oil lamps and all those things. And it would have been dimly lit. And this is now my speculation. Maybe, weddings they would have served alcohol and wine and all that. Maybe Jacob was a little bit inebriated during that time, intoxicated because of the festivities and the celebration. And also during that, the customs during those days, it required the lady to wear a veil, as many people do today. I mean, at some point in the wedding, they remove the veil, but during that time. And so, the fact of the matter is, he did not know during the night. Only in the morning, when he woke up and he got over, he is no more. He's completely sober minded. And he looks at her in the daylight. He realizes he's been duped. This is not Rachel. This is Leah. And so he is obviously enraged, and he goes to probably to Laban's tent, and he says, "What is this you have done to me?" And Laban very nonchalantly says in verse 26, "It must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." Now, this was a custom, but it was basically just an excuse that he's giving. He never explained all this to him when he struck the deal. He was just being a little elusive. He wasn't very clear. He didn't clarify anything. Now he says, "Fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also." He just refers to Rachel as this one also, "for the service for which you will serve me still another 7 years." So he has a proposal, he has an offer on the table. He says, "First, you fulfill your bridal week with Leah, and then if you work for me for another 7 years, which means total 14 years, then I will give you the one that you originally desired, my younger daughter Rachel." Now, in verse 28 says, "Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife also." And so Jacob loved Rachel so much that he was willing. I mean, many people, try and come up with different things that they would have done, or Jacob should have done in this situation. Some people say he should have said to Laban, "No, no, no, I'm not married to Leah. You take her. She's no more my problem." And he should have said, "I'm married to Rachel and left with Rachel," or something. Some people say that. Some people say he should have divorced Leah and got married to her. All those kind of different. But the thing is, he finds himself in a helpless situation. I'm sure he was ticked off. I'm sure he was angry. I'm sure Rachel wasn't happy about the whole thing. I don't know where she was in the wedding and whether they tied her up in a tent and all these things. But the point is that he loved her so much that he was willing to work for another 7 years to get Rachel. And so he does it. And then in verse 29, it says that Rachel's servant was Bilhah. That was the maid that was given to Rachel. And in verse 30, we're told, "Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah," which is a very sad thing if you think about it. It says he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. So, I think I should just say this. Polygamy was never God's original design. It was something that man did. If you look at Genesis 2, it says marriage is between one man, one woman. They become one flesh. And this is reinforced even in the pastoral epistles in the book of Titus 1:6. And it should be a one, literally, it says a one woman man, or a husband of one wife. That's another way it's put over there in the pastoral epistles. But for some reason, we don't know because the Bible is silent. For some reason, God did allow polygamy in the Bible. Maybe it was maybe it was to populate. Again, this is speculation. If you have a reason, other reason, you can share it. Why you think God allowed polygamy? I don't think he approved of it. He never approved of it, but he allowed it. He allowed it, or he overlooked it. Maybe he saw that it fulfilled some purpose, so he allowed it to happen. One of the purposes, or one of the reasons maybe he allowed it is because back in the day it was a patriarchal society, and if nobody married a woman, then because they were largely uneducated and untrained and unskilled, then they would be exploited, they would become a prostitute, they would become, sold into slavery. And so only a man could provide for during those times. A man could provide for the lady, only they could protect, and so maybe God allowed them. Could be one of the reasons why he just overlooked it. But I mean, now at this point, I mean, where we have come today, it's strictly forbidden, and it's not allowed anymore. Polygamy, that is. I think, I mean, Bible is pretty clear and explicit that marriage is between one man and one woman, and it doesn't make it any better if you're a serial marrier, if I could use that word. It's not just polygamy, like not that's banned, but if you, there are many people who are not guilty of polygamy or bigamy or whatever, but they'll have one wedding after another, and they, so that is also not something that is recommended or permitted, or something that God looks upon with favor. So in verse 31, we're told, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Seems like divine compensation, where God is also looking. And I find this verse encouraging. Of course, sometimes it might lead us to misinterpret certain events in our life as well. I say that because sometimes it happens. But I'm just glad that we have a God that sees, and He knows that He knows everything that's happening in our lives. And over here it says that God saw that Leah was unloved, which was sad because Leah was also Jacob's wife. So he opened her womb. So somewhat, like, that's why I said divine compensation. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And so, just like there was a rivalry between the two brothers, the two siblings in the previous story, that is Jacob and Esau, now there's going to be some rivalry. And we'll see that this polygamy, why I'm saying it was not approved of God, is because it's going to lead to a lot of problems. It always led to a lot of problems, even in the case of Solomon and his 300 wives, 700 concubines. A lot of problems. All the wives led him away to foreign little g gods or idols. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, "The Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now, therefore, my husband will love me." Verse 33, she conceived again and bore a son, and said, "Because the Lord has heard me that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also." And she called his name Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son, and she said, "Now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him three sons." And therefore she named him Levi. And then verse 35 says, "And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, Now I will praise the Lord." Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. So it seems like, so of course Rachel was barren, but the womb of Leah was open, and she bore four sons. The first three sons, first one she named Reuben, second one Simeon, third one Levi. All in some way, these names are connected to the pain that she's encountering or facing due to the fact that her husband does not love her as much as uh, Rachel. So, in some way, she is hoping that this child will get the attention, and then he will finally change his mind and he will treat her differently. But then finally, she comes to a point in verse 35 where she just says, "Now I'm going to praise the Lord." So there's some shift in the way she views things, and she was trying to please and hoping that her husband will start loving her. She can earn the favor, love of her husband, and get some attention from him. But then finally, her focus shifts, and in verse 35, she says, "Now I'm going to praise the Lord," and she names him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. So that is Genesis chapter 29, verses 1 to 35.